Japan, known as the Land of the Rising Sun, is a country well known for its highly developed cities. Surprisingly, though, this degree of natural beauty and traditional cultural attractions combine to make this one of the world's most popular tourist destinations, drawing millions of tourists annually. In actuality, the country's openness to outsiders has existed for well over 200 years, making it a comparatively new development. Japan's borders were strictly closed to all foreigners from the 17th to the 19th century, but throughout this period, known as Sakoku, Japanese culture flourished, and the country saw tremendous economic growth and dynamic cultural advancements that had never been witnessed before. Previously, this gave the country many of its most recognizable cultural treasures, whose traditions endure now. But how did this island nation go through such a significant shift from a time of relative isolation to one of the most advanced and open nations in the world today? This is the history. All of our videos are from Japan. For about 40,000 years, people have lived in the archipelago of islands that comprise the modern nation of Japan. Years after the initial human settlers arrived from mainland Asia, these early residents contributed abilities such. By the 3rd century, a sizable section of southern Japan had united into a concentrated power structure centered around agriculture and metalworking, which prepared the way for the founding of permanent settlements and ultimately the earliest kingdoms. The Yamato area, which was governed by a monarch and known as the emperor, a large portion of Japan's early history would be molded and impacted by cultures from the Asian mainland. Buddhism was brought to the area from Korea in 552 and later in 645. A set of changes known as the Taika reforms were put into place to change the political structure of the nation and emulate the Chinese system, which was centered on an imperial court. At first, the court lacked a stable residence and was relocated with each succeeding monarch. That was until 794, when Emperor Kammu chose to locate the capital in what is now Kyoto, ushering in the Heian era, which would remain for nearly 400 years. But as time went on, the imperial court grew opulent and too preoccupied with domestic affairs, ignoring appropriate administration of the nation outside of the capital and significantly undermining its own power, which consequently affects the land that had previously been ruled by the emperor, started to progressively fall into the hands of local noble elites, giving rise to a feudal system in Kyoto, where authority was distributed rather than concentrated at the imperial court. This reduction in the state's central authority resulted in strong, with the support of their samurai warriors, regional warrior clans such as the Taira and Minamoto gain power. They finally succeeded in overthrowing the emperor's power during the Hai insurrection of 1160, which was brought on by a dispute over the heir apparent to the imperial throne and escalated into the Jin War of 1180 to 1185, the Minamoto clan, led by Yomo, the faction leader, ultimately defeated their rivals and, after establishing a new military administration in Kamakura, which was located far from the emperor's imperial court in Kyoto, Yomo was able to persuade Emperor Guba to give him the title of shogun, or great general. In 1192, he assumed de facto control over all of Japan, bringing about a period of military dictatorship known as at the beginning of the 13th century, when one of the greatest empires in history concentrated on conquering Japan. The samurai would soon be put to the test once more by the shogunate that would rule for the next 700 years. The Kublin-led Mongol Empire in 1265 insisted that Japan acquiesced to him as a vassal state, but the Mongol leader started organizing a full-scale invasion of the nation. Although vastly outnumbered, the Mongol forces encountered a resolute but much smaller band of samurai in combat when they landed on the island of Kyushu in 1274. However, the tide of battle shifted in favor of the Japanese defenders when a strong typhoon, known as the kamikaze or divine. Almost all of the Mongol fleet was destroyed when a strong windstorm swept through the area. The Mongols tried a second invasion in 1281, but astonishingly encountered the same result as their forebears around 7 years prior, with their armies being destroyed by yet another typhoon despite having effectively eliminated the menace of invasion. Despite this, Japan's defensive actions nearly destroyed the shogunate's coffers, and, as a result, many samurai were underpaid, which severely damaged ties between the military administration and the samurai clans. Emperor Go-Dao then staged a revolution in 1333 in an attempt to regain control so that he could live with him as emperor and the imperial court. Even though Kyoto was successful in its quest, the situation only lasted for 5 years, ending in 1338. Even though the shogun's authority had been restored, actual power in Japan remained among the regional samurai clans, whose feudal lords, known as daimyo, directly controlled the shogun, after Go-Dao himself was overthrown in another coup that reinstated the shogun under the new leadership of Ashikaga Taki. The land for themselves, and these clans would frequently form coalitions and conspire to tip the scales of power within the nation as they saw fit, which frequently led to an open civil war. The bloodiest of these wars began in 1467, when the Onin War was fought to determine the successor to the throne. Yoshim, Shogun Ashikaga Masa. By taking sides in the dispute, the daimyos successfully brought down the feudal order, dividing the country divided themselves into a patchwork of smaller autonomous states during this turbulent period, which is referred to history as the Waring States or Soku period, lasted long into the 16th century and witnessed some noteworthy military advancements, including the appearance of ninjas who conducted clandestine espionage and murder operations, and the deployment of Buddhist warrior monks known as So on the battlefields. But in 1543, there was a paradigm shift in combat when a Portuguese commerce ship the 3 Portuguese traders on board were the first Europeans to arrive in Japan after being blown off course onto the island of Tanaga, just south of Kyushu. They immediately established merchant relations as part of the larger Portuguese trading network that spanned much of the Indo-Pacific region. Once a year, the Portuguese vessel, known to the Japanese as the Black Ship, arrived off the coast to buy and sell goods. The Japanese had little knowledge of these weapons, chief among them being European muskets. In a similar vein, the Portuguese brought Christianity to Japan, which significantly aided their trading operations by giving new converts preferential treatment in their ability to purchase firearms. As a result, they soon gained popularity among the feuding daimyos, seeking to obtain a tactical advantage over their adversaries, to the point where by 1556 over 300,000 firearms were being used in the ongoing civil war. As occasionally getting direct military assistance from the Portuguese, one of the most well-known Oda Noag was eager to work with the Portuguese. Despite not becoming a Christian, he effectively used the better technology of European gunpowder weapons and started to unite Japan under his control during the final phases of his attempt to seize power in 1582, but Noaga was murdered in an ambush and was soon replaced by one. Despite being the de facto ruler of a now unified Japan, Hideyoshi did not take on the role of leader of his followers. Toyoto Miyoshi was a man of humble peasant origin who had risen through the ranks of the army to become a samurai damo. He then went on to fulfill the ambitions of his former master and unify the nation, rank of shogun, possibly as a result of his peasant upbringing, and instead served as Daodien's and Kaku imperial regent. Since he was still a child, Hideyoshi asked his 5 most trusted subordinates to swear allegiance to his infant son until the time came when he was old enough to take over as chancellor of the realm. Hideyoshi died in 1598 with the intention of granting these titles to his son, Toyoto Mihiyori. Nevertheless, a civil war broke out once more between Japanese daimyos loyal to Hiyori on one side and those formerly loyal to Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu won the decisive battle at Seigahara in 1600, ushering in a new era for Japan under the Tokugawa Shogunate. This period, known as their Edo period because the shogunate government relocated to the city of Edo, lasted for 268 years without interruption. Perhaps the most defining period in Japanese history is modern Tokyo, with the relative calm and stability that descended upon the nation, allowing Japanese culture, the arts, and the economy to thrive during a time of prosperity. However, this came at a price, as the Tokugawa shogunate implemented a number of severe punitive measures to quell any potential social unrest and severely suppress the spread of Christianity throughout the nation before finally outlawing it completely. In 1638, the third Tokugawa Ieyasu was established to stop any more foreign influences from establishing themselves in the nation, established the Sakoku policy in 1639, which essentially locked the nation to outsiders and forbade any Japanese from going overseas, returning from overseas, or constructing oceanic structures. Only limited trade between boats and their neighbors, China and Korea, was allowed, and only Europeans were given commercial licenses. Were the Dutch, who were restricted to the little island of Daima of music, Nagasaki. During the rest of the 17th century, Japan continued to thrive under the Tokugawa shogunates, and its population doubled to 30 million. The government is building schools and roads to significantly increase the socioeconomic output of the country, but by the late 1700s and early 1800s, the shogunate's power was starting to wane. The agricultural boom that characterized the early Edo period had slowed, and the government's response to the disastrous famines in the 1830s was drastically insufficient around this time. Some Western concepts had progressively started to spread throughout the nation because to the publication of Dutch books that discussed the latest scientific advancements in Europe. These books were translated into Japanese and disseminated from their commercial base in Daima. In 1853, Japan's isolation would abruptly end when a fleet of American warships arrived. Arriving in Edo Bay under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, the U.S. government wanted to open Japan's ports to foreign being, unable to match the superior firepower of the U.S. forces. The Shogunate reluctantly acquiesced to Perry's demands and opened the nation to American commercial interests, later expanding this policy to other Western powers like Britain and Russia. They were also willing to use their military force to secure this goal if necessary. Many people in Japan were at risk of surrendering to the Western powers, especially those from the southern provinces of Satsuma and Choshu. They soon established an alliance and persuaded the young Emperor Meiji to issue an edict in 1868 demanding the abolition of the Tokugawa shogunate. The troops of Choshu and Satsuma then marched on Edo, sparking the Ban War and the shogunate's eventual fall. Emperor later reclaimed ultimate authority over the nation, signaling a dramatic change in Japanese governance. The imperial court moved to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, in 1869, marking the beginning of the First Restoration. Japan would then set out on a new modernization journey with the goal of becoming a fully fledged nation-state, comparable to the under the Mag regime. Western nations prioritized updating infrastructure by introducing, in addition to establishing a universal education system, railways, and telegraph lines, the government also lifted the prohibition on Christianity and enlisted the help of hundreds of Western consultants who contributed their experience in a variety of fields, including as banking, transportation, and mining to support Japan's modernization initiatives. One specific area of emphasis was on the military, which saw a major uptake of the newest Western strategies and technologies in 1877. This modernized army was sent to put an end to the Satsuma Rebellion, which had started as a result of local samurais' grievances, who had perceived their positions as the nation's conventional military becomes outdated in the face of contemporary army. After gaining control of Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, Japan also used its newfound military prowess to expand its territories abroad in an effort to mimic the colonial holdings of many of the Western nations of the era. Japan shifted its focus to Korea and China. In Japan's highly motivated and skillfully commanded armies accomplished a shock victory in the First Sino-Japanese War, which lasted from 1889 to 1895, triumph over the Greater Qing military. Following China's successful annexation of Taiwan, Japan established a major military alliance with Britain in 1902 to combat the growing threat of Russian expansion in the area. The inevitable conflict with Russia finally occurred at the Battle of the Yayoi River, which was the first time in the Russo-Japanese War, which lasted from 1904 to 1905, was the final decades in which an Asian power had vanquished a Western one. Japan's newly constructed navy nearly destroyed its Russian adversaries in the Battle of Tsushima. These military victories enabled Japan to expand its control throughout the region by annexing Korea in 1910, establishing itself not only as a regional power, but now as a dominant Asian dominance on the global scene, spurred by these recent military victories and additional goals to extend throughout the Asia-Pacific area. In order to obtain new colonies in the South Pacific that were ostensibly under German control, Japan joined the Allies in the First World War. After the war, Japan took part in the Treaty of Versailles and benefited from advantageous international ties that were strengthened by its League of Nations membership. But like many other nations during the post-war era, a development fascist and nationalist feeling started to spread throughout Japanese society, especially in the military, whose aspirations for expansion were growing. As these ambitions grew more ambitious, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937, which saw, concerned by this aggression, the international community began to mistrust Japan's intentions in the region, and as Japan's territorial acquisitions on the Chinese mainland increased, the United States imposed severe economic. As the Second World War broke out in 1939, Japan knew that sanctions would prevent any more war effort, that in order to improve its relations with the U.S. and Japan, it had to realign itself geopolitically with other countries that held similar expansionist beliefs. As a result, it formed an alliance with Germany and Italy in 1940, further occupied Southeast Asia, alienating other Western powers including Britain, the Netherlands, and France, ultimately encroaching on the European powers' colonial possessions in Asia, but Japan's government, under by Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, determined that in order to alleviate the economic sanctions, it would have to launch a preemptive strike against the U.S. forced upon it in order to protect the recent territory it had acquired in the Pacific on December 7, 1941. The United States entered World War II on the side of the Allies and started military action after the Imperial Japanese Navy unexpectedly attacked the American fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Actions against the Japanese Empire, which by this point had taken over additional Asian territories such as the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore. During a fierce and protracted conflict with Japanese forces across the Pacific, the United States led the Allies against Burma and the Dutch East Indies. One of the main goals was to conquer small islands with strategically situated airfields that might be utilized to conduct bombing attacks on the Japanese mainland. However, the progressively more expensive the United States chose to use a newly created secret weapon to force Japan to surrender because the fighting's glacial pace made it clear that a ground invasion of Japan would cause its men to suffer unimaginable casualties. Capitulation. The United States unleashed 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945, resulting in the deaths of more than 100,000 individuals. Emperor Hirohito made the public announcement of Japan's surrender to the Allies on August 14 via national radio. The next day, as the war over Japan began, General Douglas MacArthur's Allied forces occupied the country. who started the reconstruction process, disarmed the Japanese military, and democratized the government. Emperor Hirohito was permitted to stay in power, but he had to publicly deny his divine status, which had grown to be a major tenet of the state. Japan's Shinto religious system changed under Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida's leadership, its emphasis on economic development as opposed to a strong foreign policy. The Japanese economy exceeded its pre-war levels by 1955 and became the second-largest capitalist economy in the world by 1968. Over the ensuing decades, Japan would establish itself as a global leader in the automobile industry, and as a significant participant in the electronics sector, leading to a boom in the economy supported by Japanese-made consumer products. All of this post-war economic activity contributed to the transformation of Japan into the prosperous country it is today, one that ranks highly in practically every indicator of global output and progress, from economics to technology and even life expectancy. Perseverance and hard work ethic of the Japanese people, who despite enduring hardship during the last stages of the most devastating battle in history, chose to choose a completely different route in order to reconstruct a modern nation-state free from the violence, division, and inequality of the